Hey, welcome back. So this mini lecture is going to talk about the 1980s in American life, and there's a lot to understand about the 80s, but we're going to try to talk about 5 things that you need to know in order to read more and learn more about this particular time period within American history. So let's dig into it. The first off would be Reagan Revolution. So Ronald Reagan, the former Hollywood movie actor, was elected president of the United States in 1980. And he comes on the backs of this real feeling that America had sort of lost its position as a global superpower, that the supremacy of America had sort of declined at the end of the 70s. This was the era of inflation, the era of the Iran hostage crisis, and there was this real feeling again that America had sort of lost its way. And so Reagan, from an economic standpoint, from a sort of foreign policy standpoint, tried to sort of say, okay, we're gonna cut taxes, we're gonna gut programs, we're gonna, really kind of wave the saber here. And try to get America going again. And this was all part of this revolution, this Reagan Revolution that was occurring on a number of fronts. Whether you're somebody who's a fan of that kind of politics or not, it was compelling across party lines, and many individuals who had formerly been Democratic go for Reagan. So it's a very popular thing. All right, number 2, Rambo. So some of you may, in the last few years, have seen the last couple of Rambo movies, and if not, and you're going, what's Rambo? So beginning at the end of the 70s, early 80s, there was a film series that started in America and became popular all over the world called Rambo. It was based on a character called John Rambo, and in each one of the films, Rambo is portrayed by Sylvester Stallone. Now, there are many different kinds of film series that have become popular over the years. Rambo kind of stands out because he's sort of a disgruntled Vietnam veteran that has lost his way, right? Rambo has somewhat of a good heart, but is also conflicted and is capable of terrible violence. But again, in the late 70s, 80s, 90s, you have within a part of the American story this coming to grips with sort of Vietnam syndrome, which is something that scholars will call it, this idea of America needing to understand or come to grips or to battle with Vietnam veterans themselves within American life. So the Rambo series is kind of part of that public conversation about how to think about veterans and how to think about their return into society. All right, number 3, Rust Belt. So starting around the late 70s and early 80s, you're going to see a number of different things within manufacturing industries all over the United States. So increased use of computing and digitization will lead to the transformation of these workspaces, meaning there's not as many people needed for these jobs. And in some cases, yes, they're moving overseas, but either way, what it means is smaller communities that relied on these kinds of forms of employment generationally. So as far back as the 1870s and 80s and 90s, after about 100 years now, they don't need them anymore. And so that transforms those communities. A good example would be something like Pittsburgh, where you had all of these steel mills. Beginning in the early 80s, the mills start to close. The city is going to be forced to go through a real tough time and transform. And again, the term is typically Rust Belt. Number 4. The Mac and PC. So the rise of personal computing, the computer that you can take home, have at home that's not very big, that I'm talking to you through right now. This kind of thing that I'm recording this on. Beginning in the 1980s, although it was something that was relatively expensive, typically upper middle class individuals are affording home computers, and they're very different than the kinds of computers that exist now. They transform the manner in which we can interact with information and culture and society, but they're also going to, again, transform the nature of work itself, and certainly education, obviously, by the fact that we're doing this. And the last thing for us to note is, of course, AIDS. So throughout the 1980s, the AIDS crisis gripped America. Communities came to grips with hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of men and others dying. And it was a terrible time. The 80s was a time period of conservatism in America and a time period of a backlash against anyone who identified as homosexual. And it was a very, 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 very difficult time for those communities. Now, the treatment for those with AIDS has transformed in recent years, meaning that with, drugs for treatment, if one can afford these drugs, one can live, with this a bit more. But, in the 80s, early 90s, the idea that someone would be diagnosed or, would have AIDS was seen typically as a death sentence. And in many cases it was. So it was a terrible part of the American story at that time. Thank you.